Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this important event. The program will begin momentarily, but first, I'd like to share a few notes with respect to accessibility and to ensure that you have the best possible experience. First, if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. However, please monitor the chat because we will be placing a few helpful resources in there for you throughout the program. If you or someone you know needs access to closed captions, please click on the CC/live translation icon at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, if you or someone you know needs access to Spanish or Arabic translations, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you, and now we will begin the program. It is my pleasure to introduce Kiki Jameson, President of the Fund for New Jersey.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kiki Jameson, President of the Fund for New Jersey. On behalf of the Fund and our co-sponsor partners, thank you for joining us tonight for the second installment of Imagine More, Racial Justice Begins With Us. Imagine More is a first of its kind 6-part series of events that brings together national thought leaders, philanthropic and community-based organizations, academic institutions, policy advocates, jurists, and local activists from across the ideological spectrum, united around a common purpose: advancing racial justice and repairing the harmful impacts of systemic racism. Over the course of this series, you will hear from change makers who will offer action plans for making concrete changes in criminal justice, housing, education, health, and political power. While each session will focus on a different topic, we recognize that all of the topics are interconnected. This is why our speakers will also propose solutions to repair the harm created by all of these injustices and their intersections. Additionally, following each event, you will receive resources and information to connect you with the organizations doing this important work and to guide you in leading change in your own communities. We launched Imagine More last month with a focus on eliminating New Jersey's staggering racial wealth gap and ending poverty. We are enormously proud that nearly 650 people registered for the kickoff, demonstrating that not only do they understand the urgent need to address racial injustice, but that they also want to help. Tonight, we are challenging New Jersey to deliver on justice for all. So welcome to our second event, Disrupting the Criminal Justice System. We are delighted to present Amol Sinha, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey, better known to many of us as the ACLU, which has been leading the way on reimagining our criminal justice system in New Jersey, or as Amal describes it, the criminal legal system. Amol will help us to understand how the system works now, whose interest it serves, and what we can do to change the current system and to repair the harms of structural racism that infuse it. Amol will then be joined by Professor Kristen Henning, Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, and the author of The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth, and by Nafisa Goldsmith, Senior Criminal Legal Fellow at Salvation and Social Justice. Lawrence S. Lusberg, Larry, a trustee of the Fund for New Jersey, will moderate an interactive discussion with tonight's speakers and will include questions from you, the audience. And now, here is Amol Sinha. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Kiki, and good evening, everyone. First of all, let me just give a big thank you to all of our sponsors, and in particular, the Fund for New Jersey, which has been a leader and a thought partner on these crucial conversations and making sure that the advocacy space is robust. I'd like to start by zooming out a little bit. Like, we often talk about the criminal legal system like it's one massive entity that we're all subject to. Thinking about it in that way makes it seem like it's impossible to improve. But the reality is that the criminal legal system includes many players, each of whom have their own challenges and needs and biases. They impact us from childhood to adulthood, conditioning us to tolerate a police response to routine situation. The police are, for most of us, the entry point into the system. And increasingly in Black and Brown communities across the United States and here in New Jersey, we see heavier police presence, including police in schools using criminal responses to everyday childhood behaviors. Then there are prosecutors who decide who should be charged with crimes and make recommendations on how they should be sentenced. There are courts and judges who make sentencing decisions. There are legislators who create criminal justice policy and sentencing guidelines. And there are corrections officers and prison officials who manage the conditions in which people are imprisoned every day here in New Jersey. And then there are parole boards who decide when somebody can be released from prison. And there's so much more along the way. It's a sequence, it's a chronology, and it invades so much of our lives. The truth is that the work of reforming the system is the work of reforming each individual piece of it. It's a lot of work. But we at the ACLU of New Jersey and our partners, many of whom are here on this panel tonight, are working on it. And we need you to support these efforts so that we can begin to repair the harms of the deliberate injustice that has persisted in our society. And I say deliberate. It's not by accident that Black adults are 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than white folks in New Jersey. It's not by accident that Black children are more than 30 times more likely to be incarcerated than white children in New Jersey. It's not by accident that Black people are 3 times more likely to have force used against them by police. And it's not by accident that Asian, Hispanic, and Black drivers face more tickets for traffic violations, even though white drivers are pulled over more frequently for those same infractions. It's all pieces of a system designed to oppress and harm. Sunday was the 2-year anniversary of the murder of Brianna Taylor. And we're approaching the 2-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, which we all witnessed on video. And just last month in Bridgewater, New Jersey, we saw racial bias and the criminalization of Black youth in action during a scuffle between 2 teenagers at a local mall, one who appeared to be white and the other Black. And police swiftly tackled and arrested the Black child while comforting the lighter-skinned child who they sat on a sofa. These are all symptoms. They're all harms. And how do we repair the harm? We need to reimagine policing wholesale, and we need to repair the harms that policing has inflicted on our communities. We must stop by over-investing in law enforcement and start investing in real, life-affirming responses. In most instances, people don't need armed police to resolve issues, and we have to rid ourselves of our reliance on police. What they need is a school counselor, a therapist. They may need a mediator, or simply they might need a tow truck. And we need accountability when bad things happen. Over the past 2 years, bills in our state legislature to add some degree of accountability in policing have simply languished. These bills, which would allow for civilian oversight of the police, increase transparency in policing, ban chokeholds in policing, and end qualified immunity, they've all stalled. And in fact, New Jersey has taken steps backwards by giving more power to police. We must do better. So there are specific policies that we can embrace that can help us repair some of the harms. We must look at these solutions through a racial justice and reparative lens. And when we think about reparations, we often think about where and how we spend our resources. So we can start in the context of policing by scrutinizing police budgets and treating them as we do any other dollar spent in government, by diverting resources from criminal justice responses and investing them into community-based responses. When we think about reparations, we can also think about systems and supports. We can rid our schools of police officers who look at every minor infraction through a criminal lens and start investing in counselors and the care that children actually need. And when we think about reparations, we can think about community empowerment. We can pass a package of bills that would help hold police accountable. One bill in particular that's crucial is to give the public access to police disciplinary history. We need to know what misconduct our police officers engage in and how they're disciplined. Otherwise, policing is completely shrouded in secrecy, and the public is left without power because they have no insight into the people that are meant to protect and serve. More than half of the country, from conservative Florida to liberal New York, allows for disclosure of disciplinary history, but not New Jersey. So there are many things that we need to do to hold police accountable, to improve the criminal legal system, to promote transparency, and to repair the relationships with our communities. Our lawmakers and everyone in power need to hear from you. This panel that I'm grateful to be a part of will delve into some of the most pressing issues that we're facing as a society, including the deliberate oppression and criminalization of Black Americans throughout their lives, and solutions that we can embrace today. It's my pleasure to be here and to contribute to this conversation. And I'll now turn it back over to Kiki Jameson, president of the Fund for New Jersey. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amol, for those important and clarifying remarks. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Larry Lustberg, trustee of the Fund for New Jersey. Larry co-chairs the Gibbons Commercial and Criminal Litigation Group, leading the criminal defense practice, and he is a longtime director of the firm's John J. Gibbons Fellowship in Public Interest and Constitutional Law, which litigates historic, cutting-edge civil rights and civil liberties cases. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and welcome, Larry.
Thank you so much, Kiki. It's my tremendous pleasure to be here with all of you this evening to continue the Imagine More Racial Justice Begins With Us series. It's an incredibly important discussion, and tonight's has to do with disrupting the criminal justice system in New Jersey, a system that deserves disruption because it is so very flawed. Hopefully tonight's panel will shed some light on what the problems are, what the solutions to those might be, and what we can do to repair some of the damage that has been done by that flawed system in the past. Without further ado, let's meet our extraordinary panelists for tonight's session. You've already met my friend Amol Sinha, the executive director of the ACLU of New Jersey, a true hero here in New Jersey. Amol is also an adjunct professor at Marymount Manhattan College, where he's taught courses on constitutional law, civil rights, media law, and criminal justice. He's the past president of the South Asian Bar Association of New York and co-chair of the Public Interest Committee of the South Asian Bar Association of North America. You've already know how lucky we are to have him, and thank you, Amol, for being here tonight and providing the critical state policy and advocacy context to this discussion. Also with us is our new friend, Chris Henning. Chris is the Bloom Professor of Law, as you heard, and director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, where she supervises law students and represents youths accused of delinquency in DC Superior Court. She's also a hero because she was a public defender, as I was, which is the greatest thing of all to be. Chris writes extensively, and I would urge you to look at her publications about race, adolescence, and policing. Kiki mentioned early on her 2021 book called The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. It's an amazing book that not only talks about policing, but juvenile justice, two passions of all of ours. And she does an amazing job of tying those two things together. So I would commend it to you. Finally, and definitely not least, we welcome Nafisa Goldsmith, who is Senior Criminal Legal Fellow with Salvation and Social Justice, and the chair of New Jersey Prison Justice Watch. Nafisa is a well-known, longtime community organizer and activist to those of us who know her here in New Jersey, who consistently speaks out against a number of injustices, including isolated confinement in prison, something which she knows about personally. She's an amazing advocate and a powerful speaker, and we're so pleased that she's here tonight. So welcome all. I'm so honored to be with each of you. Let me start with this question for each one of you. During Amol's introduction and Kiki's introductory remarks, we learned that Black, Brown, and immigrant New Jerseyans face unequal treatment at literally every step of our state's criminal justice system, from policing to prosecution to sentencing, to conditions of confinement, incarceration, and to re-entry and reintegrating into community. I would ask each of you, what's the one single issue that you think those who are listening to us tonight should focus on, that you think contributes the most to this unequal treatment? And then we'll a little bit later talk about solutions. So Amol, let's start with you, even though people are probably tired of hearing from you. You can keep going.
Thanks, Larry. Thank you for that question. It's so hard to think about one thing that folks should focus on. And I'm gonna, take the advantage of being first and say, people should think about racism, right? Like it exists, and we should not shy away from calling it out. We should talk about white supremacy every single day. We should talk about how it plagues every single institution in American society. And perhaps some of the most stark data is available on the criminal legal system, but it is something that's apparent in every American institution, and something that we need to address head on. So often we hear about anti-racist behavior, right? These days, we hear about anti-racist things. However, it shouldn't be easier for us to name things anti-racist than it is to call out racism. And that's something that I hope our colleagues on the panel and also our audience can think about day in and day out, as it's essential to addressing the harms.
Chris, what would you say is the single issue? I mean, you're involved in several issues, as I mentioned. What would you say is the single issue that you think our audience should be thinking about and focusing on as they consider tonight's presentation?
So I want to leave everyone who is listening with the premise that America's obsession with policing and incarcerating Black and Brown America starts with the policing of Black and Brown children. Right? So we have to talk about the extraordinary over-reliance on police to basically regulate, intervene, redirect the lives of teenagers, of children, right? And especially Black and Brown children. And so what does that look like? It looks like what Amol talked about earlier, the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. I think whenever we start a conversation about the incarceration, detention, and prosecution of children, people assume that we are talking about serious violent offenses. But the research, the data, the reality is that the vast majority of children who are in courts today are there for normal behaviors that so many of us on this meeting engaged in. Boys fighting in a mall, like Amol said, at the Bridgewater Mall, adolescent aggressive speech, which is basically kids talking back to adults, property offenses, drugs, things of that nature, which we don't need traditional law enforcement responses to intervene in. And the other thing that it looks like, this over-reliance of police on police, it looks like police in schools. That's exactly what it looks like. It looks like children getting arrested for being emotional and sensation seekers and risk takers, for doing the things that kids do, and also for being getting arrested for engaging in what kids do in schools. And so I would say, for me, that's where we have to start. We have to start with the kids.
Thank you. It's awesome. Nafisa, why don't you tell us what you think, coming from your perspective, the single issue that people should focus on during tonight's presentation should be?
I would say erasing the white patriarchal mindset that we all have come to subscribe to. And that goes into believing all things that society puts out about specifically people of color. Have to unveil ourselves and to be able to look at what's really there. And so what that is that there are blinders, and we have to be able to say that this is not what America should look like. This is not what our state should look like. The highest racial disparities here in the state of New Jersey in our prisons. This is very real. Racism is extremely real. And until we can just say it for what it is and not feel in any way, ashamed, that this is something that still exists in our system, I think we have to just look at white supremacy and say enough is enough and stop buying into it.
So let me follow up, Nafisa, to that statement by saying, what's your view from where you sit of what the long-term intergenerational effects of the kind of over-criminalization of New Jersey's Black, Brown, and immigrant communities is? What are the long-term effects for this society in which we live, from your perspective?
It's frightening. It's frightening because if we continue this, like I said, wearing the blinders to this Black and brown manhunt that's going on, it would almost be as if, people of color are extinct in this state. You're throwing away our youth if there are no youth, and if there are no credible youth, or youth who could be what we would like to say as, productive citizens who do not have any kind of blemishes on their criminal record. I think that would be very few and in between. And so it would be extremely sad, but also it would be indicative of, once again, a system that has never allowed Black and brown people in it. And we know that when we use those words like re-entry, that we've subscribed to, once again, those societal constructs to make us think that we are reforming a system that has so many cracks in it. Why would you want to use those same materials to reform it? Why would we want to adopt a language and belief systems and behaviors that subscribe to this system? So I would really just say that it would be a very sad state of affairs if we continued on hunting Black and brown bodies.
So Chris, you write a lot about children, and I suspect that you have strong feelings about what the intergenerational effect is as those children grow up, and where some of the conduct comes from. I mean, what's your view of the intergenerational effects of the kind of racism that Nafisa and Amol have so compellingly discussed tonight?
Yeah, this is such an incredibly important conversation. I got to tell you, Larry, there is research. There is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that policing and criminalization imposes on Black and brown children at one of the most important stages of their development, those adolescent years. Studies show that Black and brown children who live in heavily surveilled, heavily policed communities, and who are the frequent targets of stops and frisks, report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hyper-vigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And here's what's important: that distrust of police officers transfers over to other adult figures, right? Many of whom might be allies for them. what is so incredibly powerful about that research, Larry, is that it shows that this trauma occurs even without being the direct target of the police contact. Just hearing about it from friends and family or witnessing it in your community is enough, right? So getting up in the morning and having to worry about being the victim of some sort of police violence, for example, and as Amol mentioned, watching the killing of George Floyd on television, right? And I say to folks all the time, imagine what it must be like to be a Black or brown child who can say, that could happen to me next, right? And so there's this body of research about the impacts of watching these events on the internet and on television, and how young people in their adolescent years are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is what's really important also, it has an extraordinary impact on an adolescent's self-esteem, their sense of who they are, who they can become, how they engage with the rest of society. And it has an impact on their understanding and perceptions of the fairness of law and law enforcement. Right? So young people begin to question whether or not it makes sense to even participate in mainstream society. So this gets at, Nafisa's point about the making, the fact that young people of color may become extinct. It's certainly extinct as, no longer willing to engage and participate in our society because the traumatic effects are so extreme.
I'm going to move on to talk about some of the solutions to what we've been discussing. Amol, in your opening remarks, you laid out some possible solutions, and some of those go to issues like reparations. I wonder if you could, just for the audience that may not be so familiar with some of the technical legal stuff, one of your concerns was qualified immunity, and you proposed getting rid of qualified immunity as a solution to some of the problems. Could you explain to people what that is and why you think that would be an important reform?
Sure, happy to, Larry. So qualified immunity is a legal concept and doctrine that shields police officers from liability, civil liability. They effectively can't be sued for even the most egregious conduct. So there have been instances where police officers have committed acts of violence against people, where they have killed people, and the victims of that violence and their families can't even set their foot in the door of a courthouse because the lawsuit will be dismissed before it even is heard on the merits because of this concept of qualified immunity. The justification behind it is, look, we don't want police officers having to second guess themselves as they make split-second decisions. And of course, some of us may believe that to be the case, right? We don't want police officers having to second guess themselves. However, what we've seen, even if it's justified in some form, what we've seen and witnessed over the years is that concept of qualified immunity has morphed into something that produces tremendously absurd results, where people who are killed by police, in some instances where there may be even some sanction